Hey, everybody, welcome to today's episode of the What Worked For You show. Today, our focus is on small business. And what do I mean by that? I mean, a lot of small businesses, as the stats show, they just don't make it, right? You can Google the stats and see how the vast majority don't last more a year or 2 years, 5 years, whatever the case may be. But today, we're going to talk about how to not be part of that statistic, but rather being the one that does make it and not only makes it, but becomes more profitable. A lot of businesses, and I've seen this myself in real estate, they only make a few grand a month. Our guest today, she is big on taking people from, where did I say the example? She used a $3,500 a month to $35,000 a month. That's 10 times more. Imagine what that does for your business. And of course, it can be beyond that. So today we're going to be talking about how she got into this, what her background is, and how she helps businesses achieve just that, to be more profitable and these are the businesses that made it statistic, not the far too crowded one of the ones that didn't. So Patricia Stepler, thanks for coming on the show today. How are you?
I'm doing great, Frank. Thank you for inviting me.
Wonderful. Well, let's dive in. You've helped business owners scale to $35,000 to $100,000 months. And in the small business space, that's a very big deal. What's one success story you have that kind of gives you goosebumps when you think about it? It was so like, wow.
Yeah, it was actually my first clients, and I just love the fact that they entrusted me to help them. And they were a small construction company at the time, making about 180,000 a year. And when they hired me to help them, their goal was to build dream homes and to build, very, very sophisticated places. And yet, mostly what they were doing was, installing windows or doors or, something very small and easy. And even though they were profiting 180,000 a year, none of that was going in their own pockets. In fact, they were spending, it was a woman-owned business, and they were spending a lot of her husband's salary just to keep their business afloat. So when I started working with them, we slowly started to figure out like what they really wanted, and they wanted to build these luxury homes, and how do we get there? And so it was a matter of them beginning to shift their focus and shift their ideas and starting to really invest in themselves as well as invest in their business. And so every year for about the first 6 years, they doubled or tripled their income. Now they're, a flourishing business, not necessarily in the luxury home business. They were actually working commercial, and they're making 13 million and plus a year.
Wow. 180 to 13 million.
Yeah.
That is quite the change right there.
Yeah. Change in their whole business structure and in their whole lifestyle, really.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. That's awesome. You know, the change in thinking that you mentioned it right in there, that is where it all starts, is the thinking, right? And a
Absolutely.
lot and a lot of coaches talk mindset, but you got to pair it with productivity and profitability. Like like what does high performance in business look like today from your perspective? Because there's so many viewpoints on something like, oh yeah, we're a performance business, we're high performance, we're that, and it's like, what does that really mean?
To me, it means that you've got a goal and you've got a plan and you do something. High performance is actually, doing something every day to move yourself forward. And a lot of times, business owners, especially in the small business arena or even solopreneurs, they're busy. They're busy all the time, but are they busy doing something that's really productive and focused on the end result of their goal? Or are they just busy with to-do list type things? So to me, a highly productive business is one where you've got a goal and you're moving towards it every day, and you've got a team that's helping you to move there, and everybody's kind of got their direction going in the same way instead of pulling against each other.
So let's talk about the smallest of business owners for a moment, the solopreneur,
Mhm.
right? They have to do everything. And so they hear about, and at least that's the thinking, right? Obviously they can hire things out and so forth. But for that solopreneur that's just getting started, or maybe they've been solopreneur for so long that they can't let go of things, because it's very common. Like I'm in real estate investing, there's plenty of those.
Hmm.
And we hire lots of contractors, and there's no shortage of contractors that are solopreneurs. And of course, we can go into countless other businesses where that's the case. And they hear this idea of team, but maybe they're not in a position where they can hire someone, or maybe they are in a position where they can hire someone, but they don't have the skills to hire the right person. They're not confident to do it. They're not sure what the recruiter's saying or their own. I don't know about what ad do I put, right? You get into all the details. What should that person absolutely be doing first and foremost before they're ready to jump into this idea of team?
Well, I can relate to that because, of course, that's where I started. I was a solopreneur. I thought I had to do everything myself. And I think there's value in learning how to do things, but there are some things that if you think that's the way to go, you really need to hire. And let me just give you an example. I just, because I thought I had to do everything, I did this whole study course on how to do Facebook ads. I couldn't care less about a Facebook ad. I don't really care about how to do it, but I thought I needed to learn it. And so I spent tens of thousands of dollars investing in this guy that was going to teach me how to do it. A smarter investment would have been to hire that out. So sometimes even things that you think you need to learn, it's better investment of your time and energy to hire it out. And sometimes that's hard, if you're not earning a lot of money, with your clients that you're serving, sometimes you have to really dig deep to see, okay, is this a good investment or is this a waste of my money? And sometimes you just need to kind of figure out, is this something I really care about or something I don't care about and would rather hire it?
So, what is that criteria? So, a small business owner comes along and says, I need to do X, Y, Z. Do I do it myself or do I hire it out? It always seems to start there, right? And of course, if you get on social media, there's no shortage of people offering X, Y, Z ways to do effectively anything. Maybe it's good, maybe it's not, or maybe you don't use social media, right? Maybe you go to a network meeting, a mixer, you meet someone that's offering this. Like there's solutions to seemingly everything everywhere. But I like what you said. You're like, when you use the Facebook ad example, you're like, well, that wasn't really something you really cared about, it sounds like. But sometimes the flip side argument is sometimes we have to do things we don't enjoy doing. So how do we make that determination to our solopreneur listeners so that they can say, hey, okay, this needs to be done, suck it up, buttercup, versus this needs to be done, but I don't need to do it. How do they make that distinction?
Yeah, so one of the things that I do is that's exactly what I help people with that are starting a new business to make sure that you're doing things in a logical order because I did not. And I was always listening. Like you said, you'd go on social media, talk to one person, and they say, oh, you need to do this. So then you go over there and you try to learn how to do that. And then it doesn't seem to work because maybe you never built the foundation. It's like building a house. Are you building a strong foundation to put that second and third story on, or are you building a weak foundation? The whole thing's going to collapse. And that's what you have to be really cautious about. Are you building a strong foundation to begin with? Because I did not. And, so I'd go from one thing to another, just, moving back and forth, trying to figure out the answers. And then after I was in my business for a couple of years, somebody pointed out that I'd never branded myself. Well, to me, I did because I had a logo and I had colors, and I thought that's all I needed. And you don't know what you don't know. And so it's really important to find somebody that will bring you through those basic foundational steps. What's your messaging? What kind of marketing are you going to start with? What social media are you going to use? Instead of trying to do too much and getting good at nothing.
Yeah, no, for sure, for sure. So you created this thing called a QBA method. So
Yes.
what is that?
Okay.
And what makes it different? So first, what is it? But then what makes it different, right? Because there's lots of systems out there.
Mhm.
What makes this different so that the growth you talk about, it's really going to happen? And I want to say this because there's a lot of people that will try systems. They do it kind of in a half-hearted way, and then they burn themselves out because they were half-hearted. And you're just like,
Right.
yeah,
Right.
which of course that's not never going to work. But what? Go ahead.
Right. So the QBA method is quantum business accelerator, which is what I want people to have. I want them to accelerate where they are. And this is basically what I used with the clients I was telling you about in a construction business, where there's a foundational point in this, and we're building an image of both the person, who's the owner, and the business. So we're getting that branding out. So we're connecting the business to the person. We're also making sure that you have that strong foundation. You know your messaging. You know who your target market is. You're figuring out exactly where you want to go. And that doesn't mean that you don't make shifts, because just like that company wanted to build these luxury homes, now they're in commercial. They made a shift along the way because they found out what they thought they wanted wasn't exactly what they did want. And that's okay. But, I think what makes this very different is that it's not a cookie cutter approach. It's not everybody does the same thing at the same time. I look at where somebody is and what their needs are, and where it's going to best serve them. So there's some individual work there as well as some group work. And I'm trying to put like the modules in the right order for them. So let's say they want to build that new business. Well, let's start out with those foundational points. Who are you messaging to? Who is it you're going to target, and get that down. But let's say the business is a little more established. Well, maybe you want to go to the next step. Maybe you want to go into more of the social media, and where you're going to go, or making reels. So I'll help you with that. Or maybe you're going to speak from the stage. Well, let's get your speech down. So it's a little more flexible than a lot of models are, where you have to, like, I know I've been in different programs. I've gone through like the basic same things over and over again, and yet that wasn't where I was at. So I take people from where they are and put them into the part which is most necessary, but making sure that we do go through that mindset, because 95% of your business's mindset.
So you meet people where they are. And I love that because I think that's the only way any real change can happen anyway. Far too many programs are do this, do that, and they're good programs.
Mhm.
But I like the way you bring that distinction up of, yeah, the program could be great, but if it's not where they're at, they're probably not going to get the result. So what's the key to this idea of meeting people where they are? Because quite frankly, a lot of people, they don't even know where they are.
You're
And I've
exactly
been
right
there.
with
So I'm
that.
speaking, I'm talking to me. I've been there. So
Right. And that's not unusual. You do have a lot of people that don't exactly know, have a clear idea, which is why we do the mindset. Because in the mindset, it's not just about like becoming more positive, it's about really clarifying what your goal is, and making sure that that goal is an exciting goal. Because if you don't have an exciting goal, you're not really going to go after it. And that's why I think a lot of people get really frustrated, because they have a goal that they think they can achieve, but it's not what they really want. So that's the first piece is, well, let's get to what you really want, and figure out, where you are now, where you want to be with that goal, and then how do we move forward with that? And that's key. And then the next thing is, okay, so what do we need to overcome? Because we all have limiting beliefs. There's not one person that doesn't get to some level and have a limiting belief. So what is it that is causing you to limit your idea of what you can accomplish? And then, okay, so how do we then become that person? Because everything that you have today is you've accomplished because of who you think you are. But if you have a really big goal and you're going after something that's you don't know how to achieve, you're going to have to transform yourself. You're going to have to become somebody different. And that's something that a lot of people don't seem to realize that they really have to grow into that person that they want to be. So, how do we become that person? And then, okay, now that we've done that, let's align who you are with what you want and now put the actions forward.
There's a lot there. So I want to go back to the beginning because it starts there, right? It's this idea of a compelling goal.
Hmm.
Some people call it a compelling why. But your why and your goal may not be the same thing. So, we got to definitely have that distinction. But it could be the same, but it may not be the same. But I remember Tony Robbins said once, most people have impotent goals. And I thought that was I never forgot that. So, I thought that was like, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But and I know you studied with Bob Proctor, and and you were a consultant for his institute and so forth. And Bob, of course, was well revered and so forth. This idea of a compelling goal that actually moves you, like how do you define that? Because I just say I've looked, and I'll use myself as an example. I've had goals that I've written down and be like, you know what, it's a great goal. It was a nice goal. It would be great to accomplish it, but it didn't compel me, the core of my soul. And I think that's where I've seen people struggle is they have these goals, but do they really move you at the core of your soul?
So
And so, yeah, no, I was just saying, go ahead. Just how do we make sure our goals really are our real goals that move
yeah,
us?
because sometimes we set a goal because we think that's what others think we should set. You see this a lot with children. They will set a goal that maybe they think their parents want them to achieve. And so that would not necessarily be compelling. Then you have to also look at, okay, so you set this goal, but do you believe you can achieve it? And that is huge because if you don't believe you can achieve it, you're not going to go after it. And so you have to develop that belief, and sometimes that's what it takes. If you think that's your goal, but you don't really believe you can achieve it, then how do we change that belief? And that's what Bob was really good at, helping people to understand that they needed to change their self-image, they needed to change their thought process so that they actually believed they could achieve it.
So, yes, for sure, right? Like if you don't believe you can achieve it, but let's say, for example, and we're going to use an extremely generic example, but quite frankly, I've heard this come out of contractors' mouths, so maybe it's not too generic. Hey, this year I want the business to do X. Let's just pick a generic number, $1 million. Like, is that, and let's say they're a solopreneur, is that too big of a goal to aim for? Because on one side, and this is what I see all the time, and this is something I've personally experienced, again, there's that one side who's like, yes, I believe I can do it, I can do this and this and this. But on the other side, you're like, you don't even know if it's too big. And then depending on who's helping you or coaching you or mentoring you, or maybe it's just the person you're talking to down the street, right? Who knows? One person might tell you, yes, it's achievable, and the next person say, oh, that's not realistic. You got to set a smaller goal. So you kind of get into this, okay, I want to do this, but you don't even know. You set yourself, self-development oftentimes is you don't know what you don't know. And then sorting that out. It's like, how do you know, all right, this is compelling, like, because the goal that might move you might be very unrealistic, at least initially, right? So do those people, should they aim lower? Or maybe you flip it, right? It's like, okay, this goal is real compelling, but maybe it's compelling because it's super easy to get there and they need to set higher. Where is the right balance, if there even is such a thing?
Yeah, that is a very good question. I know I had a friend who worked for a bank, and they were supposed to move. He worked mostly with commercial accounts, and he was to get X amount of people to purchase their credit card for their business. And so he set this goal to, I don't know, 15, we'll say. And he did it in January of the year. And he goes, okay, I met that goal. I don't need to worry about that the rest of the year. And, what kind of goal was that? Something that he knew he could achieve so easily. And he just wanted to get it out of the way. And then you're right. Other people will said, okay, I want to make $1 million this year. Well, maybe they made 10,000 this past year. Is that realistic? So you have to look at, okay, is it possible? Well, sure, anything's possible. Is that the best goal to set, or is that a wish? And there's a difference between a wish and a really good goal. So one of the things I like to do with clients is to break down that goal. Okay, you want to get to the $1 million. Okay, so let's divide that out. What do you have to do each month to get there? Okay, so what do we have to do each week? What do we have to do each day? What about morning and afternoon? Then you can, like, when you break it down into the smallest piece, then you're going to be able to decide, can I actually accomplish that? And if, I don't know what $1 million broken down every year would be per day, but is that possible with what you have? And if it is, great, then let's go after it. If it seems a little unrealistic, okay, let's back it down a little. Maybe that $1 million is 2 years or 3 years down the road, and that's okay. But let's figure out what's possible, because here's what we know about the brain, that in your mind, if it's so big that you don't believe it, you won't really go after it. So we need to break it down into pieces so that you know it is achievable. And yes, I want people to always dream bigger and to think bigger, but sometimes we need to take a step back and say, okay, based on what you have, based on the time you have, is this achievable? And yes, you want to set it a little bit above, or maybe a little bit more above what is it, you think achievable, so it's exciting to you. But on the other hand, there is that balance between what's realistic and what's just a dream, and you just won't, your mind won't wrap around it.
So you reverse engineer it, but what if that person, like, that's what it takes to move them? Like, it's not realistic. It's not, right? Like, just logically, the odds of this happening are very low. But if that's what it takes to get them even compelled to move, should that person still go after that?
Yes, they should. And so that's when we come down to the techniques that we use. How do we get about shifting your mindset? Because you do, so in our subconscious mind, we have these patterns of beliefs, we have these patterns of behaviors. And so if they say, okay, but I want that $1 million, well then, okay, let's figure out how we're going to change your thought process. And that's when we do the affirmations. That's when we write out our goals. That's when we spend time studying. In fact, I just read an article the other day about some of the top wealth earners in the country have this 5 hour rule. And the 5 hours is that every week they spend 5 hours learning and studying. And that's what we all need to do to be really successful. We think if we just do things, that's enough, but we have to always be learning and sharpening our skill. So that's one of the things when I work with clients, I do have an expectation that they're going to take it seriously, and they're going to spend some time doing the techniques that I tell them they need to try in order to accomplish that goal. But if you really have that big goal and that's what you want to accomplish, then you're going to have to change your thought patterns that you have.
Absolutely. So let's take it one step further. If your goal is the one that will move the needle, that okay, this is what I really want. Is this idea of change the way to gauge that goal is strong enough? And what I mean is, if a goal is you think in your mind, it's compelling, I really want to do it, but you're not willing to do all the change necessary, maybe that's not a compelling enough goal. Or is our willingness to change a good guide for determining, okay, this is the one to go after?
It is the willingness to change, making that decision and then being willing to change. So, can I share with your audience how I got into this to begin with?
Sure. Well, that was going to be my next question. So perfect. It was
So,
like, how do we get into this? Yeah. So I was to say,
yeah,
going back, because you were a teacher for 32 years.
right, right.
And
So, I um I was a teacher and I also did a lot of personal development. And I just call it more traditional personal development, more that like John Maxwell, Zig Ziglar type things like that. It was not with Bob Proctor. I'd heard his name, but I'd never come across him in like 25 years of doing this. And it was when my son was 12 and my oldest daughter was in college. My second daughter was about to go to college and he was 12 in sixth grade. And he came to me and he said, Mom, you don't have to ever worry about putting me through college. And I said, Oh, really? What are you going to do? And he says, I'm going to earn a full scholarship to school. And I said, And how are you going to do that? And he said, I'm going to be a collegiate athlete. Well, immediately my mind went to the fact that he was also a juvenile diabetic. And being an insulin dependent diabetic, there were a lot of challenges when he played sports. And even though he had talent, I kept thinking that's 6 years away. That is a long time when you're at that age. And yet he kept telling me that over and over and over again. And that's what we have to do. We have to keep telling ourselves something over and over and over again. And, I told him at one point, you know, every time you told me that, I didn't believe him. I'll be honest with you. I never believed him. I thought he might get, $1,000, $2,000, something like that, but I never expected him to get a full scholarship. And then he chose baseball. Well, if you talk to collegiate baseball coaches, they'll tell you there's no money in baseball and, not to expect a full scholarship. So he just kept believing this. And he just kept telling me over and over. And he told me that as many times as he would tell me that story, that he was getting a scholarship, he was telling himself that more. And he said every time he went to practice, whether it was in baseball, basketball, or football, he was going to practice for a full scholarship. Like that was always on his mind. His total focus was there. But years later, and this is what led me to Bob Proctor, because I had to figure out how he actually did get a full scholarship because it shouldn't have happened. And when I started studying with Bob Proctor, what I realized was that he was following all the rules of the universe. Only he didn't know it. He was just doing what he thought. And he told me years later, he said, Mom, he said, when I told you that I was going to get a full scholarship, I figured I better, figure out a way to do it. Figure out a way to do it. And that's what he did. He had plans. He had, the team he thought he needed to be on to get seen in the summer by coaches. And it didn't work. His plan did not work. And he thought he had totally blown the opportunity. But what he didn't realize is, it's like that story when God closes a door, he opens a window. And we have to be willing to find those other opportunities. So even though the school that he finally went to told him he could expect maybe a third, half at the most, when he got his scholarship letter, it was a full scholarship. And before he opened that letter, he said to me, Mom, wouldn't it be funny if this is a full scholarship? To which I reminded him what the school had said. Now, they only said a third and a half. So, it was just, he didn't know what he was doing. I had to figure out what he did because I didn't know what he had done either.
Wow. Wow. So you went through that experience. How did this lead into, or just where into this process do you decide, you know what, I want to coach business?
Yeah. So that's kind of funny. Um, yeah, I'd always wanted to do something with business, and I dabbled in, some side things all through my teaching career. And so when that happened, I was like, I have to share this information. I need to get this out. And so that, like I said, led me to Bob Proctor. I started studying with him. I was still teaching at the time. And then it was like, I realized that even though I think my own three kids are amazing, the children I taught were amazing too, but they didn't have that parental support. And, I was like, they have so much potential, and we all have so much potential. So then that led me to my next thing that I did, which was corporate training. And I went into that because I thought, I think I can impact adults to maybe impact their own children. And, so that led me to work with this other company. Well, then that was still frustrating too, because I still couldn't give people what I felt they needed because of the contract I was under. And so then that's when I started my own business, because it was like I knew what businesses needed, but I had to be able to work with them in a closer way and to work with them repeatedly, because at the time I was, more or less doing a presentation for a day and then I was done. Well, you can't strengthen a business in a day. And so I really started to realize that a lot of business owners and supervisors, managers, whatever they happen to be, were having the same issues with their employees that teachers did with children, which further,
Funny
helped
how
me to
that happens.
realize people never really change much. And so if you never really change much, how are you going to unleash your potential? We do have to change something within ourselves.
So that's a great segue into my next question. It's a perfect segue. And that is, what is it you taught? Because you taught for 32 years.
I taught music actually.
So you were teaching music. I'm a
Mhm.
musician too, so I love it. And I've taught music as well, so love that. So you're teaching music, you're teaching students. Was that high school, middle, elementary,
I did
college?
middle and elementary.
Middle and elementary. So, so the younger kids, which that's all my wife does, has done that. So totally get it. So
Yeah.
you went from teaching that to now you're teaching adults. Like, and this is something I'm always fascinated because I've met other people that have made that shift from teaching into entrepreneurship. And they've echoed a similar idea. It's like, man, it's like the habits, like what you see when they're growing up, that's what you're going to get. What do you think is one of the reasons why when kids are in, you know, from K through 12, why is, because, and I used to teach high schoolers, they're sponges as long as you push them to be
Mhm.
sponges and they are willing to change. Why do we see such resistance to change when people are older, when all those years up to K-12, it's really not that hard to get kids to change? Because by nature, they're still young and they're learning and they want to know everything. Even when they tell you they know everything, they still want to know everything.
Yeah. So I think we have to be careful that we're looking at the difference between learning and our subconscious mind and our image that we have. Because our self image is actually very much formed by the time we're 8, and most of it we didn't form. It was ingrained in us. So up until about 7 or 8 years old, everything that we see around us or hear around us just goes pouring into our subconscious mind. Our conscious mind, however, is the one where we can, form new things and we learn things. So that's the part where you're talking about with the sponge, and you're learning things all the time. And that's in the conscious mind. the subconscious mind is really there to protect us. And so, the image that we hold of ourselves is so ingrained in us, and those limiting beliefs are in our subconscious, and they're trying to keep us safe. And so, if we don't really work to change who we are, the core of who we are, then those limiting beliefs and that self-image will always pull us back. And that's why people, start out trying to do something different and then they go right back to where they were because that subconscious is so strong and controlling them. So even though in your conscious mind, you can know exactly what you want to do, but if it's in conflict with the image that you hold of in your subconscious mind, you're doomed until you change the subconscious mind. So, to really change that, which is basically what my son did. He changed the image of who he was. He kept building that, and we changed it the same way it was done to us by constant spaced repetition, by saying, I'm getting a scholarship, I'm getting a scholarship over and over and over again. You start to change that thought process of who you are and what you can do.
Love it. So, and I agree with you, right? The subconscious is there. It's there to protect us. It's also there to limit us.
Yes, it does do that.
And that seems to be the cause of many problems, not by malintent, but out of, again, that protection mechanism. So now we've got to influence this subconscious mind. And for a lot of people, you hear these things and you learn, and it's still kind of like this. I don't want necessarily to say woo woo, but it's like this.
Mhm.
It's not tangible. I can't like tap on it. I can't like open a book and read the word. It's all, it literally is in our head, literally.
Right.
So how do you get people to truly make this shift? And it's interesting that you were an educator, because I've met numerous educators that quite frankly struggle with this concept. Some incredibly brilliant people, masters, PhDs, whatever, taught for a long time, but it's that they're not immune, right? Like this idea of, oh, I can shift my subconscious and everything changes. It's like a foreign language. So it's this idea of you can change your subconscious. It's very powerful. What do you find as, like, what would you tell a client? Do this, it will work.
And I love what you just said about how difficult it is. The concept is easy. The doing it is difficult. And I remember one time I was at a training with Bob Proctor, and he was speaking. I mean, we were all consultants in a room, and he was struggling with his laptop. And he finally asked, one of the technicians in the back of the room to bring his old laptop up. And he went on to tell us, he said, that he had just gotten this new laptop and he didn't particularly like it because he doesn't like change. And at that moment, I bet all of our jaws just dropped. Here's this master person at the mind. And he goes, I'm no different than you are. He said, nobody likes to change. And so I think that's a constant thing you have to work over. And that's where the dream and the goal has to be big enough that you're willing to go after and to do the difficult things. Some of the things, I have people do is that repetition. It's got to be that repetition over and over and over. And if you've ever read the book Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill, he was trained by Andrew Carnegie, who was at the time the wealthiest person in the world. And Andrew Carnegie gave him this statement to repeat over and over again. He said, you do this, look in the mirror, you say this, like twice a day. And he said, it's when he first gave him the statement, he says, it's never going to happen. And it was basically that he was going to impact more people than Andrew Carnegie did. He said, Mr. Carnegie, this is never going to happen. And he said, well, of course it won't if you don't believe it. And so he did that. He looked in the mirror, he would say the statement every day. And he said by the middle of the month, he started to believe, well, maybe it could happen. And then by the end of the month, he knew it could. And so it's that spaced repetition because that's how we learn. And if you just think of learning math in school, you didn't go into school one day and the teacher said, okay, we're going to learn how to add single digits. Okay, you've done that. Now we're moving on to double digits. It doesn't happen that way. You repeat things over and over again until you get the concept. And it's the same way with changing your mindset. It's spaced repetition. And it's even fascinating. Sometimes I'll go on a walk and I'll be listening to Bob Proctor on some tape and or anybody really. And I may have heard it 100 times, but that day I hear something different because that day I'm not the same person I was the time before I listened to it.
Hmm.
And every day, if you're learning and you're growing as a person, you become somebody different. Your awareness level changes and you're hearing things that you've heard before. That tape did not change, but I did. And so you pick up and you start to learn more and you start to experience more and that's how we actually change. It's not easy. The concept is, it's like, oh yeah, that makes sense, but doesn't mean it's easy to do.
So this brings up a question, and that is, I love that example because we can all relate to it. I hear it I go back and hear it later, and you learn something new that you didn't hear last time. You're always hearing about people say you should read a lot, and I agree, you should.
Mhm.
And I like to read, and used to like to read, but I like to read. But I also heard somebody say once, and he was actually an assistant to a very well-known worldwide speaker. He came in the room. He's like, "I hope you don't buy another book this year." And the whole room was like, and he was like, "Oh, wait." And but the whole idea was, before you go buy yet another book, did you really take in the one you had and implement it? So the thought is, do you read a book once and then another, and then come back to it like months later? Or do you take a book and read it again and again and again, maybe three, four times, take action on it before you go to the next one?
Yeah, that's what I do. And in fact, I just got rid of a whole bunch of books this summer. Just, like I'm never going to read this book again. I have a few core books that I love, and my favorite book is The Science of Getting Rich by Wallace D. Wallace, which was written way back in the early 1900s. And when I read that book, I read it every year. And sometimes I'll just read through the whole thing. But other times I'll take, like what I'm doing right now, I'll just read a chapter and I'll spend maybe a week just reading the same chapter over and over and over again. And maybe more than a week if I don't feel like I've gotten it. Because, if you're reading just, some novel that was written that's, not a business type book or a book that's trying to improve you, maybe you just read it through once. But if you're reading a book that's really trying to help you change, you're going to have to read it over and over again. And this is why. Because just like I gave that example of listening to, my iPod and listening to something that Bob had recorded, it's the same way with reading a book. Our minds go off on tangents. And so you'll be reading and all of a sudden you're like, I don't even know what I just read. Well, how many times do you actually go back and reread it? Sometimes you do. Sometimes you're like, yeah, I got this idea, go on. And, our minds will wander, which is another reason why you don't pick up on things. And if you read something over and over and over again, you're finally going to get to a point where you say, okay, now I got it. And I know that's something I did learn from Bob. Sometimes he'll read just a paragraph over and over and over again until it got cemented into his mind and we understand it. But here's the thing with a lot of this information, even at that point, it just floats right out. And it can be a little frustrating. But that's why you have to keep going over and over as to the principles. And it will never master them all. Nobody will ever be a master at all the, success principles because it's just you learn it and then it just like escapes you and
Well,
you have to come back to it.
and you keep getting better, so your
Yes,
perspective on it will change.
exactly.
No, that's so true. And it's so fascinating what you shared about Bob that even he didn't like change. And he
Mm.
was all about change.
It was.
So if you're all about change and you don't like change, well, you know what? You're in good company.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
you're in good company. So don't beat yourself up. So you've worked with difficult teams now, and disengaged employees, leaders on the edge of burnout, across these different businesses. Like, what's one thing you learned about human nature and dealing with people in these challenging positions that is pretty universal, but by the same token, it's the first thing that is maybe the easiest to change?
I think one of the things that I've noticed the most is that sometimes we don't really understand other people. And I think in today's world, we tend to want to make other people believe like we believe or think like we think. And, we all have different experiences and backgrounds. And we have to start to listen to other people's perspectives because maybe our way isn't the best way. Maybe our thoughts aren't the best thoughts. And if we're not willing to listen to others, then we shortchange ourselves and shortchange the team, and people get frustrated and leave. And I remember the one time I was doing a training. So I do a program called Five Behaviors of Cohesive Teams, which is based on Patrick Lencioni's book. And I remember when I was at a training with this, I started to say we were sharing, our experiences and our upbringing and how we learned. I said, well, back when we were young, and then I continue with my story and this one lady looked at me and she goes, you have no idea how I was brought up and what my experiences are. And when it was her turn to share and she shared her story, I'm like, she is exactly right. My life was so different than hers that, just understanding where she came from. So if you're in a workplace situation, we can't assume that people were brought up like us or that we understand everybody. And we have to really start to listen and figure out, why do they think differently? Why do they want to do something different? And really take into account other people's perspectives and be more understanding of others, and that goes a long way in helping to build a better team because when you can do that, then your team builds trust and we trust each other more, and that makes a huge difference in a workplace.
How do we get people to get, and I love that story that you talked about a lady who shared her story, and you're like, wow, yeah, I totally had no idea, wouldn't have thought of it that way. But we live in a day and age now where it's almost like conscious desperation to put people in a box, right? You see it on the news, you see it on the media. Just at the time of this recording, obviously, we had the whole Charlie Kirk thing happen, which has created its own challenges, right? Beautiful ones
Mhm.
and maybe not so beautiful ones. And it's like, it's almost like people are literally desperate to put someone else in a box to suit what makes sense to them at that point in their life with whatever their belief system is, and right, and we've talked about that forever. But we've seen this at the small business level as well. It's like it's like, well, I think this, I meet you, you say XYZ. Well, that doesn't exactly work with what I'm thinking, so how do I put you in my box so that this makes sense?
Yeah, and I think that comes down to, being willing to listen to others and, being vulnerable, and realizing that, we maybe we don't know the answer to something and being willing to ask a question and listening to others. But I think we spend a lot of time prejudging people and not listening. And I'm not sure why or where that's coming from, But that becomes a problem. And when you can shift that around and you can get people to be more open and vulnerable, and maybe social media, you have all that, somebody looks really great in social media and they could be just having a horrible time inside, but they're making it look good. And, can we be vulnerable and say, I'm having a rough day and I don't know how to do this. Can you help me? Are we able to do that?
Well, I like the phrase you said, prejudging. It's almost like an addiction in today's world.
Hmm.
But as an entrepreneur, if you're going to prejudge, there's no way you're going to get to your goal. And so effectively, you're basically putting up your own roadblocks. And I think every entrepreneur that's had success probably can relate to that, has experienced it, where you prejudge something, all of a sudden you're like, and then you basically go through the school of hard knocks to realize I was basically feeding myself a line that was not true. How do we eliminate prejudgment?
I think again, it just
Million
it
dollar
goes,
question.
yeah, just go back into the deep thought. And, there are, when you really do take time to figure out who you are, I think that's another thing. We don't really know who we are.
Mm,
We go through school and, we are put in boxes. Educators, in schools, they take every, you know, round peg and try to put it in that square hole or whatever, the other way around. And, they're trying to put everybody in a certain compartment and we don't know who we are. And I even see this with parents. There's helicopter parents, which are trying to run their child's life and they're not allowing them to be who they are. And we don't take time to really figure out who we are, what we want to do, who we want to be. Here's an example. So my nephew had a friend who this friend's dad was an attorney. And I met this guy through high school and college, and he was like, I do not want to be an attorney. And so he graduated and he just figured out what he wanted to do, but then he didn't know what to do with his degree. Next thing I know, he's taking the LSATs. And I'm like, why are you doing that? I thought you didn't want to be an attorney. Well, I don't know what else to do. And so he went to law school for 1 or 2 semesters and he dropped out because he did not want to do that. But but here's the problem. So he didn't know what else. He didn't know who he was. And so he went into college in a career that really he wasn't sure how to develop. And then he, actually got a job in something that I think was really good for him. But, he never really knew who he was and what he wanted to do. He just knew he didn't want to be an attorney.
mm.
And I think that's a lot of it. We may know what we don't want to do, but do we know what we do want to do? And so we really have to take time to just stop and ask ourselves, what is it I want to do? And deep thinking. We do a lot of surface thought thinking, but we don't do deep thinking. And that's when you really get to know who you are and, where you might want to go. And, sometimes maybe reading some really good books that make you think are, good idea.
So there's a lot of entrepreneurs today. They're exhausted. They're ready to quit. In large part, I would even argue that it's because of what you just said. They've worked hard at something that wasn't even necessarily in alignment with who they are. And by the way, you don't have to be an entrepreneur to do that. There's plenty of people with jobs today that hate their job.
Yes, that's true.
Plenty. There's no shortage of that. But it's like you said, it's like, and when you were talking like people, your parents put you in a box. What's one of the most classic boxes? Mom and dad say, go to college.
Hmm.
Maybe you want to go, maybe you don't want to go. Half the time I just go because I'm just supposed to do it without even giving it a thought if this even makes sense.
Hmm.
And there's nothing wrong with going as long as it's in alignment. But if you don't know who you are, it kind of almost minimizes what you do because you never really maximize. Someone might argue differently on it. I don't know. But it seems to me that if you don't know who you are, it's going to be very hard to truly maximize your potential.
Yeah. And I was stuck in that. So Um, I remember when I was probably, I don't know, fifth grade maybe, my parents, there was a new vocational technical school that opened up in our community, and my parents took us there. We went through the school and toured it, and I thought it was, my choice of what I was supposed to do. And so I remember saying to my mom, well, I wouldn't mind being an interior designer and going there and or being, a beautician. And I remember her looking at me with so much anger in her voice, and she goes, you will be going to college. Like I had no choice. I was going to college. And so you have to realize I was a third generation college. My grandparents who were born in the late 1890s, they all went to college. All four of my grandparents were college graduates. And so it was just expected. And, I was trying not to put that expectation on my own kids. But again, I'm also a third generation educator because I didn't know what I wanted to do when I went to college. And I remember when I was there, had my parents been able to afford it, I would have asked to stay another year or two and picked up a business degree because I really didn't want to teach. When I did start teaching, I enjoyed it and I loved working with children. And I think even some of those generational occupations you're good at because you've seen the example of, I saw the example of my grandparents that were teachers and my mom and dad were both teachers. And so you just become good at it because you see what they do. But it wasn't necessarily what I wanted to do. And it took me, 32 years to figure out maybe this isn't really what I wanted to do my whole life.
Plenty of people can relate to that. So let's conclude with one more question to answer that. How does someone ultimately figure out who they are?
You
What's the
just
secret?
really, yeah, you've got to just go into a room and close the door and have total silence and go deep inside and figure out who you are. And you've got to just take all everything that you've learned or everything that you've been told, because, like I said, all that information going into when you were a child and your parents or, friends may have been telling you what you should do or what you shouldn't do. And you just have to get rid of it and just figure out what is it you really enjoy? What do you really want to do? And again, sounds easy, but it's not because you really have to take some time and it may take you a month of just thinking about what do I really want to do? It could take longer than that, till you really figure it out because you've been so inundated with living in your senses and what you're hearing and seeing and feeling around you. And, you really have to just go deep inside.
Turn off social media.
Exactly.
Just turn it off. Delete the
Yeah.
apps. Not doing you a bit of good. So,
Yeah.
uh, I mean, it has its place, right? But no, that's wonderful. Thank you, Patricia. Just, it is such a key question. It's one that I think every adult deals with, it seems like. I don't meet a lot of people that they figured out who they are and what they love early in life. There are some, but they seem to be the exception. Most people, we're going to go for a while and then be like, what am I doing? Right.
Yeah,
So
I agree. Yeah.
I think that's easily the vast majority, whether it's employee, entrepreneur, doesn't matter. So, well, Patricia, thank you for sharing these insights today. Just some good probing thoughts to consider as we go down this journey of being an entrepreneur. And so, to our audience, if you're looking for someone to coach you, mentor you in your business, she is, right? She's consultant, she's mentoring. Maybe you're a solopreneur, maybe you are a small business with a team, whatever it is, she can help in that area. So, we'll have the links to her below. And she's got a freebie giveaway about it, go from 3,500, 35,000 a month. We'll put that link down there below. But yeah, I encourage you to reach out to her if it's something that could be a great fit. Obviously, she's got a lot of wisdom to share on this. So, Patricia, Thank you again for coming on the show today. Very fascinating chat, and one that needs to be shared more often. So, can you leave us with a final word?
My final word is you can never outperform the image you hold of yourself.
Short and sweet. I love it. Just get that image right.
Yep.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Patricia. I appreciate you coming on the show and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you.